The Two Avant-Gardes by Peter Wollen. Film history has developed unevenly so that in Europe today there are two distinct avant-gardes. The first can be identified loosely with the co-op movement. The second would include filmmakers such as Godard, Straub, and Hulier or Wheeler, Hunaun, Jansko. Naturally, there are points of contact between these two groups in common characteristics, but they also differ quite differently or quite sharply in many respects. Aesthetic assumptions, institutional framework, type of financial support, type of critical backing, historical and cultural origin. There are other filmmakers too who do not fit neatly into either camp, and films which fall somewhere in between or simply somewhere else. Jackie Reynolds de Foix, for instance, but in general, the distinction holds good. At the extreme, each would tend to deny the others the status of avant garde at all. Books like Steve Dwoskin's Film Is or David Curtis's experimental film do not discuss the crucial post 1968 work of Godard or Gorin, for example. And supporters of Godard and Godard himself have often denounced the co op avant garde as hopelessly involved with the established bourgeois art world and its values. The reason for dismissal are often quite beside the point and misplaced. By no means all the directors, to use a word taboo in the other camp, in one group work with narrative in well, what was I? In one group work with narrative in 35 millimeter. As you might sometimes imagine, Godard has worked in 16 millimeter for years and recently with video to open up another hornet's nest. Conversely, many co op filmmakers are well aware of political issues and see themselves, in some sense, as militant. Not that political militancy in itself is any guarantee of being avant garde. The position is complicated too by the fact that in North America there is only one avant-garde centered on the various co-ops. There are no obvious equivalents of Godard or Straub Hewlett, although their influence on their influence can occasionally be seen in John Joss speaking directly, for example. Moreover, American critics and theorists of the avant garde have long tended to overlook their European counterparts or see them as derivative. The Europeans, and perhaps particularly the English, then tend to react by stressing their own credentials, making claims to have occupied the same ground as the Americans earlier or independently. From outside, the quarrel often looks of secondary importance. After all, no one denies that the capital of narrative fiction, 35 millimeter film, is Hollywood. However, innovative European directors such as Antonioni or Fellini or Truffaut may be. In the same way, New York is clearly the capital of the co op movement. Consequently, from New York, Godard looks much more distinctly European than Crin or Legras, a fact which simply reflects the realities of power in the art world to which the co op movement is closely tied. Indeed, there is a sense in which avant garde co op filmmaking in Europe is closer to New York than Californian filmmaking is, and the leading New York critics and tastemakers, Stentney, Michelson, are not appreciated in San Francisco any more than they are in London. It seems to me much more important to try and understand what unites and separates Godard and Straub Huillet on the one hand and say Godal and Wyborny on the other than what unites and separates European and North America, or than what separates Europe and North America within the co-op. co-op ambit. Moreover, I think the absence of any avant-garde of the Godard type in North America could ultimately prove a severe limitation on the development of the new American cinema itself, narrowing its horizons and tying it unnecessarily closely to the future of the other visual arts, condemning it to a secondary status within the art world. Close relationship with quote art and quote painting, post painting, is both a strength and a weakness. To understand further the split which has developed within the avant garde, it is necessary to go back in history. A similar split can be seen in the 20s. On the other hand, films were being made by Leger, Murphy, Pacavia Clare, Egling, Richter, Man Ray, Moholy, Nagy, and others, many of them discussed in Standish Lauder's recent book on the Cubist cinema, that were attempts to extend the scope of painting, to move outside the confines of the canvas, to introduce the dimensions of time, to use light directly as well as color, and so on. On the other hand, there were the Russian directors whose films were clearly avant-garde, but in a different sense. Eisenstein's Strike, Davinsky's Venegora, Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera. It was only at the very end of the decade that there was any real contact between the two groups, when Lisitsky, whose ideas about the electromechanical spectacle and admiration for Egling put him clearly in the painters group, first met Vertov to discuss the Stuttgart Film and Photo exhibition, and when Eisenstein and Richter on his first trip out of the Soviet Union and went with him to the conference at Les Serres, which turned out to mark the end rather than the beginning of an epic. As today, part of the difference lies in the backgrounds of the people involved. One group came from painting, the other from theater, Eisenstein, and futurist sound poetry, Vertov. Davinsko, in fact, had trained as a painter but deliberately gave it up, leaving all his painting materials behind him in Kharkov when he set off for Odessa and the film studios, seeking a complete break with his past. And, of course, there are premonitory links between these different currents of the 20s and those of recent years. Godard and Gorin carried out their collaboration under the name of the Ziga Vertov group. Van Doesburg in 1929 already anticipated many of the ideas of, quote, expanded cinema, end quote, realized decades later. Quote, the spectator space will become part of the film space. The separation of, quote, projection surface, end quote, is established. The spectator will no longer observe the film like a theatrical presentation, but will participate in it optically and acoustically, end quote. Painting, I think it can be argued, played the leading role in the development of modernism in the other arts. To break the Cooper, to use the Althusserian terminology, the shift of terrain that marked the substitution of one paradigm or problematic for another, the beginning of modernism, the work of the historic avant-garde, was a break that took place in painting preeminently with the discoveries of Cubism. It is not hard to see how painting affected the other arts, how clearly Cubism had a decisive impact on Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound, for example, in literature, and later on William Carlos Williams, Apollo Lanier, Marinetti, Mayakovsky, Klebnikov, all were influenced at a crucial point by their encounter with Cubism. The innovation of Picasso and Braque were seen as having an implication beyond the history of painting itself. They were intuitively felt, I think, very early on to represent a critical semiotic shift, a changed concept and practice of sign and signification, which we can now see to have been the opening up of a space, a disjunction between signifier and signified, and a change of emphasis from the problem of signified in reference the classic problem of realism to that of signifier and signified within the sign itself. When we look at the development of painting after the Cubist breakthrough, however, we see a constant trend towards an an apparently even more radical development, the suppression of the signified altogether, an art of pure signifiers detached from meaning of much as much as from reference, from sin as much as from Bedeutung. This tendency towards abstraction could be justified in various ways. A transcendental, simplified could be postulated in symbolist or spiritualist terms, a meaning located in the Überwelt of pure ideas, a theory of formalism, of art as pure design could be proposed. The work of art could be defined in terms of objecthood, pure presence. It could be explained as a solution to a problem often set by the relationship between a signifier, a form of expression in Jaumlev's phrase, and its physical material support, the matter or substance of expression. Literature, on the other hand, tended to fall back into forms of writing in which the signified clearly remained dominant. Modernism could be interpreted in terms of the expression of subject matter. New narrative techniques, stream of consciousness, or play on the paradoxes of meanings and reference. Paradiddleism. It is significant, for instance, that so many of the most radical experiments, such as attempts at sound poetry, were the work of artists or writers working closely with painters. Art, Schwetters, Van Doesburg among them. In theater, the most radical developments were invariably associated with changes in set design and costume, including the use of masks. Meyerhold's constructivist theater in the Soviet Union, Schleimer's Bauhaus theater, Artaud. In this context, it should be added Brecht appears as little more than a moderate. Cinema is, of course, a form of art employing more than one channel, more than one sensory medium, and uses a multiplicity of different types of code. It is affinities with almost all the other arts, most are music and verbal language, as well as natural or artificial noise, can form elements of the soundtrack. Theater and dance can be elements of the profilmic event, placed in front of the camera to be photographed. Editing can be used to develop narrative or to produce a quote visual rhythm by analogy with music. Film itself can be painted or paintings can be animated. Light can be used as a medium, and through projection, a third dimension can be introduced to, to produce a kind of mobile light. Cinema, too, has its own, quote, specifically cinematic, end quote, codes and materials associated with the various phases of film production. As a result of this variety of multiplicity, ideas have fed into filmmaking from a variety of sources in the arts. One powerful influence has come from painting, bringing with it a tendency to abstraction, pure light or color, and non-figurative design or deformation of conventional photographic imagery involving prismatic fragmentation and splintering, the use of filters or stippled glass, mirror shots, extreme and microscopic close-ups, bizarre angles, negative images, all of which are found in 20s film. Editing tend to follow principles of association related to poetry or dream or analogies with music. Shots of fixed length, repetition, and variation, attempts at synesthetic effects, theories of counterpoint. But this influence and the films associated with it are marked as much by what they exclude as what they include. Primarily, of course, verbal language was missing and also narrative. During the silent period, the absence of language was not foregrounded. It seemed a natural quality of film, but in retrospect, its significance can be seen. Language is still excluded from an enormous number of avant garde films, which are shown either silent or with electronic or other musical soundtracks. Again, there are real technical and financial reasons for this, but these practical uh, disincentives coincide with an aesthetic itself found on concepts of visual form and visual problems that exclude verbal language from their field and may be actively hostile to it. This is part of the legacy of the Renaissance that has survived the modernist break almost unchallenged, except in isolated instances. Except in isolated instances. Lysitsky, Duchamp, Picabia, and extremely important recent conceptualist work. There is one further important point that must be made about the development of film in relation to art history. Filmmakers at a certain point became dissatisfied with the search simply for kinetic solutions to pictorial problems. As in films of Man Ray and Macaulay Nagy, and began to concentrate on what they saw as specifically cinematic problems. Structural filmmaking over the last decade has thus represented a displacement of concerns from the art world to the film world rather than an extinction. This way of thinking about art, this way of thinking about art has remained one that filmmakers have in common with painters and other visual artists, but an effort has been made to insist on the ontological autonomy of film. Thus, for instance, Godard's work has foregrounded and been in a sense, quote, about, end quote, focus. Legrise's work has foregrounded and been in a sense, quote, about, end quote, painting or printing or projection. The tendency of painting to concentrate on its own sphere of materials and signification, to be self reflective, has been translated into specifically cinematic terms and concerns, though here again, quote, specifically cinematic, end quote, is taken to mean primarily the picture track. Thus, the impact of avant garde ideas from the world of visual arts has ended up pushing filmmakers into a position of extreme, quote, purism, end quote, or, quote, essentialism, end quote. Ironically, anti-illusionist, anti-realist film has ended up sharing many preoccupations in common with its worst enemies. A theorist like Andre Bazin, for instance, committed to realism and representationalism, based his commitment on an argument about cinematic ontology and essence that he saw in the photographic reproduction of the natural world. We now have, so to speak, both an extroverted and an introverted ontology of film, one seeking the soul of cinema in the nature of the pro-filmic event, the other in the nature of the cinematic process, the, uh, the cone of light or the grain of silver. The frontier reached by this avant-garde has been an ever-narrowing preoccupation with pure film, with film, quote, about, end quote, film, a dissolution of signification into objecthood or tautology, a or end quote. I should add, perhaps, that this tendency is even more marked in the United States than in Europe. Where does the other avant-garde stand? Here, as one would expect, the tendency goes in the opposite direction. The Soviet directors of the 20s, though they saw themselves in some sense as avant-garde, were also preoccupied with the problem of realism. For the most part, they remained within the bounds of narrative cinema. The most clearly avant-garde passages and episodes in Eisenstein's films Experiment and Intellectual Montage remain passages and episodes which appear as interpolations within an otherwise homogeneous and classical narrative. There is no doubt that the dramaturgy is modernist rather than traditional. The crowd as hero, typisch, Guig Mall, but these are not features, or Guig Mall, or Guig Mall, not sure. But these are not features that can be attributed to a break with rather than a renovation of classical theater. They are modes of achieving a heightened emotional effect or presenting an idea with unexpected vividness of force. In Eisenstein's work, the signified content in the conventional sense is always dominant, and of course, he went so far as to dismiss Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera as, quote, formless jack straws and unmotivated camera mischief, contrasting its use of slow motion with Epstein's La Chute de la Mansion Usher, what is that? The Fall of the House of Ushers, I believe, in which, according to Eisenstein, it is used to heighten emotional pressure to achieve an effect in terms of a desired content or goal. Vertov's film, of course, a milestone for the avant-garde, and it is a sign of its richness that it can be seen as a precursor both of cinema verite or cinema verite and of structural film, though also evidently a sign of its ambiguity and its uncertainty caught between an ideology of photographic realism and one of formal innovation and experiment. In broad terms, what we find with Soviet filmmakers is a recognition that a new type of content, a new realm of signifieds, demands formal innovation on the level of the signifier for its expression. Thus, Eisenstein wanted to translate the dialectical materialism of his worldview from an approach to subject matter to an approach, or let me read it back. Thus, Eisenstein wanted to translate the dialectical materialism of his worldview from an approach to subject matter to an approach to form. through a theory of montage that was itself dialectical. The aesthetic was still counter-based. It saw signifiers primarily as means of expression, but at the same time, it demanded a radical transformation of those means. It was an aesthetic that had much in common with the avant-garde positions of, say, Lager or Man Ray, but which also kept a distance of which the fear of formalism is symptomatic. It is as if they felt that once the signifier was freed from bondage to the signified, it was certain to celebrate by doing away with its old master altogether in a fit of irresponsible ultra leftist and utopianism. As have as we have seen, this was not so far wrong. The case of Godard, working 40 years or so later, is slightly different. In Godard's post 1968 films, we glimpse something of an alternative route between con- con- contism and formalism, a recognition that it is possible to work within the space opened by the disjunction in this location of signifier and signified. Clearly, Godard was influenced by Eisenstein's theory of dialectical montage, but he develops it in a much more radical way. In the last resort, for Eisenstein, conflict occurred primarily between the successive signifieds of images. Although he recognizes a form of dialectical montage in the supremacist, suprematist paintings of Malbec, he himself remains within the confines of, quote, naturalism, end quote. Interestingly enough, he identifies a middle road between naturalism and abstraction, which he relates somewhat surprisingly to Bala in, quote, primitive Italian futurism. Godard takes the idea of formal conflict and struggle and translates it into a concept of conflict not between the content of images, but between codes and between signified or between signifier and signified. Thus, Lague Savier, which he began shooting before the events of May 1968 but completed after, Godard tries programmatically to, quote, return to zero, end quote, to decompose and then recompose sounds and images. For Godard, conflict becomes not simply collision through juxtaposition as in Eisenstein's model, but an act of negativity, a splitting apart of an apparently natural unity, a disjunction. Godard's view of bourgeois communication is one of a discourse gaining its power from its apparent naturalness, the impression of necessity that seems to bind a signifier to a signified, a sound to an image, in order to provide a convincing representation of the world. Godard's view of bourgeois communication is one of a discourse gaining its power from its apparent naturalness, the impression of necessity that seems to bind a signifier to a signified, a sound to an image, in order to provide a convincing representation of the world. He wants not simply to represent an alternative, quote, world, end quote, or alternative, quote, worldview, end quote, but to investigate the world process or to investigate the whole process of signification out of which a worldview or an ideology is constructed. Lague Savior ends with the following words on the soundtrack. Quote, this film could not wish to explain the cinema or even constitute its object, but more modestly to offer a few effective means for arriving there. This is not the film that must be made, but it shows how, if one is to make a film, one must necessarily follow some of the past paths traveled here. End quote. In other words, the film deliberately suspends, quote, meaning, end quote, avoids any teleology or finality in the interest of a destruction and reassembly, a recombination of the order of the sign as an experiment in the dissolution of old meanings and the generation of new ones from the semiotic process itself. Put another way, Le Gay Savior is not a film with a meaning, something to say about the world, nor is it a film, quote, about, end quote, film, which, after all, is simply a limited part of the world of interest in itself to filmmakers and film students, but a film about the possibility of meaning itself, of generating new types of meaning. The array of sign systems at work in the cinema are thus brought into a new kind of relationship that each other and or with each other and with the world. Nor, of course, is Godard indifferent to what types of new meanings are produced. Although his work is open ended, it does not offer itself simply for a delirium of interpretation, as though meaning could be read in at all by the spectator. Signifieds are neither fixed or fixed as far as possible, as they are in conventional cinema, nor are they freed from any constraint, as though the end of a content dominated art meant the end of any control over content. In a sense, Godard's work goes back to the original breaking point at which the modern avant-garde began, neither realist or expressionist on the one hand, nor abstractionist on the other. In the same way, the Demoiselles d'Avignon is neither realist, expressionist, or abstractionist. It dislocates signifier from signified, asserting as much a dislocation as such a dislocation must the primacy the primacy of the first without in any way dissolving the second. It is not a portrait group or a study of nudes in the representational tradition, but on the other hand, to see it simply as the investigation of painterly or formal problems or possibilities is to forget its original title, La Bordelle Philosophique. The same could be said, of course, about the large glass. The battle between realism, illusion, quote, literature, end quote, and art, and abstraction, reflectiveness, Greenberg modernism, is not so simple or all encompassing as it may sometimes seem. There are two other topics that should be mentioned here. The first is politics. As I suggest as I suggested above, it is often too easily asserted that one avant-garde is, quote, political, end quote, and the other is not. Peter Godard, for example, defends his films on grounds that clearly imply a political position, and the supporters of Godard instruct Hewlett by distinguishing their films from those of Karmitz and Pontecorvo, are constantly forced to assert that being, quote, political, end quote, is not in itself enough, that there must be a break with bourgeois norms of diegesis, subversion, and deconstruction of codes, a line of argument which, unless it is thought through carefully or stopped arbitrarily at some safe point, leads inevitably straight into the position of the other avant-garde. Nonetheless, in discussing Godard, the fact that his films deal explicitly with political issues and ideas is obviously important. He does not wish to cut himself off from the political Marxist culture in which he has steeped himself from before 1968 and increasingly since. The culture, moreover, is one of books and verbal language. The important point, though, is that a film like La Gay Savior, unlike some later work of Godard, as he fell under Brecht's influence, is not simply didactic or expository, but presents the language of Marxism itself, a deliberately chosen language, as itself problematic. Politics. The influence and presence of Marxist writing has been an obvious of impetus impetus and strength for guitar. Oh my goodness. Politics. The influence and presence of Marxist writing has been an obvious force of impetus and strength for Godard, but it also relates to another question, that of audience. On the whole, the co-op avant-garde, happy though it would not doubt be to find a mass audience, is reconciled to its minority status. The consciously political filmmaker, on the other hand, is often uneasy about this. The representatives of Marxist culture are on the whole aesthetically conservative, and avant-gardism is damned as elitism. Godard, as is well known, defended himself against the charge by citing Mao's dictum about the three types of struggle and placing his own work and film under the banner of scientific experiment rather than class struggle, an instance in which theoretical work could be justified and take precedence over political work in the short term, at least. Market. Yet, it is also clear that it was pressure to rediscover a mass popular audience which led to the artistic regroupment of Tout va bien, which abandons avant-gardism for a stylized didacticism set within a classical realist frame, though with some Eisensteinian interpolations. The second topic is that of, quote, intertextuality. To use Julia Kristeva's terminology, one of the main characteristics of modernism, once the priority of immediate reference to the real world had been disputed, was the play of allusion within and between text. Quotation, for instance, plays a crucial role in Demoiselle d'Avignon, and indeed the large glass. In avant-garde writing, it is only necessary to think of Pound and Joyce. Again, the effect is to break up the homogeneity of the work, to open up spaces between different texts and types of discourses. Godard has used the same strategy, not only on the soundtrack where whole passages from books are recited, but also on the picture track, as in the quotations from Hollywood Western and the Cinema Novo in Ventest. Similarly, the films of Straub Huillet are almost all layered, end quote, like a palimpsest. In this case, the space between text is not only semantic but historical too, the different textual strata being the residues of different epochs and cultures. It is significant, perhaps, that the latest films of Malcolm Legris have a similar quality of intertextuality in their quotation of Lumiere and Lee or what is it? Le déjeuner sous l'arbre. The Lumiere film is especially interesting in comparison with, for example, Bill Brand's remake of Lumiere's deconstruction of a wall film. It is not simply a series of optical recombinations like cinematic anagrams, but an investigation into narration itself, which by counterposing different narrative tones, so to speak, neither dissolves nor repeats Lumiere's simple story, La Arrosière Arrosée, but foregrounds the process of narration itself. And this, as we have seen, is semiotically very different from foregrounding the process of projection. The way into narrative cinema is surely not forbidden to the avant-garde filmmaker any more than the way into verbal language. Cinema, I have stressed earlier, is a multiple system. The search for the specifically cinematic can be deceptively purist and reductive. For most people, after all, cinema is unthinkable without words and stories. To recognize this fact is by no means to accept a conventional Hollywood oriented or Bergman and Tonioni Benuel oriented attitude to the cinema and the place of stories and words within it. It is perhaps the idea, so strongly rooted by now, that film is a visual art that has brought about a blockage. Yet this idea is obviously a half truth at best. The danger that threatens is that the introduction of words and stories, of signifieds, will simply bring back illusionism or representationalism in full flood. Clearly, this fear is the converse of Eisenstein's anxiety about, quote, unmotivated camera mischief, end quote. There are good reasons for these fears, but surely they can be overcome. I have tried to show how the two avant-gardes, or I have tried to, oh my goodness, I have tried to show how the two avant-gardes we find in Europe originated and what it is that holds them apart. To go further, I would have to discuss as well the institutional and economic framework in which filmmakers find themselves. The basis of the co-op movement, as has often been pointed out, lies in artisanal production, with filmmakers who do as much as possible themselves at every stage of the filmmaking process. If there are performers involved, they are usually few, generally friends of the filmmaker, often other filmmakers. The other avant-garde has its roots much more in the commercial system, and even when filming in 16mm, Godard would use stars known in the commercial cinema. The difference is not simply one of budgets. Dwovskin or Wyborny have made films for TV as well as Godard, and Dwovskin's are clearly much more conventional, yet they are almost automatically assigned different cultural places. It is much more one of the filmmaker's framework of reference, the places from which they come and the culture to which they relate. The facts of uneven development mean, too, that it would be utopian to hope for a simple convergence of the two avant-gardes. The most revolutionary work by, or the most revolutionary work both of Godard and of Straub Huillet was done in 1968. La Gay Savior and The Bridge Room, The Comedian and the Pimp. In comparison, Tout van Bien and Moses Tout in comparison, Tout van Bien and Moses and Aaron are a step backwards. Godard works increasingly in isolation, cut off from any real collective work or movement. In La Gay Savior, Juliette Berto says towards the end that half the shots are missing from the film, and Jean-Pierre Léaud replies that they will be shot by other filmmakers, Bertolucci, Straub, Gruber, Rocha. We can see now how wrong Godard was in some of his judgments. The shots missing from his film could be supplied by the other avant-garde, and it is not clear that he has ever realized this. Nonetheless, though a simple convergence is very unlikely, it is crucial that the two avant-gardes should be confronted and juxtaposed. History in the arts goes on, as Victor Shklovsky long ago pointed out, by Knight's moves. During the first decade of this century, when the historic avant-garde embarked on its path, the years of the coupure or coupure, the cinema was still in its infancy, scarcely out of the fairground and the Nickelodeon. Certainly not yet the seventh art. For this reason, and for others, including economic reasons, the avant-garde made itself felt late in the cinema, and it is still very marginal in comparison with painting or music or even writing. Yet, in a way, the cinema offers more opportunities than any other art. The cross fertilization, so striking a feature of those early decades, the reciprocal interlocking and input between painting, writing, music, theater, could take place within the film of cinema itself. This is not a plea for a great harmony, a synesthetic Gesamtkunstwerk in the Wagnerian sense, but cinema, because it is a multiple system, could develop and elaborate the semiotic shifts that marked the origins of the avant-garde in a uniquely complex way, a dialectical montage within and between a complex of codes. At least writing now as a filmmaker, that is the fantasy I like to entertain. At least writing as a filmmaker, at least writing now as a filmmaker, this is the fantasy I like to entertain. And I was reading The Two Avant-Gardes by Peter Wollen.